All right. I am Lady Rain, and this is the Reader's Nook, and we are reading The Stand, and we are on chapter 32. Shall we? Chapter 32. Someone had left the door open between maximum security and the cell block beyond it. The steel-walled length of corridor acted as a natural amplifier, blowing up the steady, monotonous hollering that had been going on all morning to monster size, making it echo and re-echo until Lloyd Henry thought that, between the cries and the very natural fear that he felt, he would go utterly and completely bug-shit. "Mother!" a hoarse, echoing cry came. "Mother!" Lloyd was sitting cross-legged on the floor of his cell. Both of his hands were slimed with blood. He looked like a man who had drawn on a pair of red gloves. The light blue cotton shirt of his prison uniform was smeared with blood because he kept wiping his hands dry on it in order to get a better purchase. It was 10 o'clock in the morning, June 29th. Around 7 in the morning, he had noticed that the front right leg of his bunk was loose, and since then he had been trying to unthread the bolts that held it to the floor and to the underside of the bed frame. He was trying to do this with only his fingers for tools, and he had actually gotten 5 of the 6 bolts. As a result, his fingers now looked like a spongy mess of raw hamburger. The 6th bolt was the one that had turned out to be the bitch kitty, but he was beginning to think he might actually get it. Beyond that, he hadn't allowed himself to think. The only way to keep back brute panic was not to think. "Mother!" He leaped to his feet, drops of blood from his wounded, throbbing fingers splattered on the floor, and shoved his face out into the corridor as far as he could, eyes bulging furiously, hands gripping the bars. "Shut up, cock knocker!" he screamed. "Shut up! You're driving me fucking batshit!" There was a long pause. Lloyd savored the silence, as he had once savored a piping hot quarter-pounder with cheese from McDee's. Silence is golden. He had always thought that was a stupid saying, but it sure had its points. "Mother!" The voice came drifting up at the steel throat of the holding cells again, as mournful as a foghorn. "Jesus," Lloyd muttered. "Holy Jesus, shut up! Shut up, you fucking dimwit!" "Mother!" Lloyd turned back to the leg of his bunk and attacked it savagely, wishing again that there was something in the cell to pry with. Trying to ignore the throbbing in his fingers and panic in his mind, he tried to remember exactly when he had seen his lawyer last. Things like that grew hazy very soon in Lloyd's mind, which retained a chronology of past events about as well as sieve restraints water, or a sieve retains water. Yeah, it doesn't. 3 days ago, yes. The day after that, Prick Mathers had socked him in the balls. 2 guards had taken him down to the conference room again, and Shockley was still on the door, and Shockley had greeted him. "Why, here's the wise-ass Pussbag. What's the story, Pussbag? Got anything smart to say?" And then Shockley had opened his mouth and sneezed right into Lloyd's face, spraying him with thick spit. "There's some cold germs for you, Pussbag. Everybody else has got one from the warden on down, and I believe in share the wealth. In America, even scummy douchebags like you should be able to catch a cold." Then they had taken him in, and Devens had looked like a man who was trying to conceal some pretty good news, lest it should turn out to be bad news after all. The judge who was supposed to hear Lloyd's case was flat on his back with the flu. 2 other judges were also ill, either with the flu that was going around or with something else. So the remaining bench warmers were swamped. Maybe they could get a postponement. "Keep your fingers crossed," the lawyer had said. "When would we know?" Lloyd had asked. "Probably not until the last minute," Devens had replied. "I'll let you know. Don't worry." But Lloyd hadn't seen him since then, and now, thinking back on it, he remembered that the lawyer had had a runny nose himself, and ow, ow, Jesus. I don't know why I have a box there, but I want to flatten this book a little bit. There. He slipped the fingers of his right hand into his mouth and tasted blood. But that friggin' bull had given a little bit, and that meant he was going to get it for sure. Even the mother shouter down there at the end of the hall would no longer bother him. At least, not so badly. He was going to get it. After that, he would just have to wait and see what happened. He sat with his fingers in his mouth, giving them a rest. When this was done, he'd ripped his shirt into shreds and bandaged them. "Mother? I know what you can do with your mother," Lloyd muttered. That night, after he had talked to Devons for the last time, they had begun taking sick prisoners out, carrying them out. Not to put too fine a point on it, because they weren't taking anyone that wasn't already far gone. The man in the cell on Lloyd's right, Trask, had pointed out that most of the guards sounded pretty snotty themselves. "Maybe we can get something out of this," Trask said. "What?" Lloyd had asked. "I don't know," Trask said. He was a skinny man with a long, bloodhound face, who was in maximum security while awaiting trial on charges of armed robbery and assault with a deadly weapon. "Postponements," he said. "I don't know." Trask had 6 joints under the thin mattress of his bunk, and he gave 4 of them to one of the screws, who still seemed okay to tell him what was going on outside. The guard said people were leaving Phoenix, bound for any place. There was a lot of sickness, and people were croaking faster than a horse could trot. The government said a vaccine was going to be available soon, but most people seemed to think that was crap. A lot of radio stations from California were broadcasting really terrible things about martial law, army blockades, homeboys with automatic weapons on a rampage, and rumors of people dying by the tens of thousands. The guard said he wouldn't be surprised to find out that the long-haired Comsimp Pervos had done it by putting something into the water. The guard said he was feeling fine himself, but he was going to get the Christ out just as soon as his shift was over. He had heard the Army was going to roadblock US 17, 910, US 80 by tomorrow morning, and he was going to load up his wife and kid and all the food he could get his hands on and stay up in the mountains until it all blew over. He had a cabin up there, the guard said, and if anyone tried to get within 30 yards of it, he would put a bullet in his head. The next morning, Trask had a runny nose and said he felt feverish. He had been nearly gibbering with panic. Lloyd remembered as he sucked his fingers. Trask had yelled at every guard who passed to get him the fuck out before he got really sick or something. The guards never even looked at him, or at any of the other prisoners, who were now as restless as underfed lions in a zoo. That was when Lloyd started to feel scared. Usually there was as many as 20 different screws on the floor at any given time. So how come he had seen only 4 or 5 different faces on the other side of the bars? That day, the 27th, Lloyd had begun eating only half of the meals that were thrust through the bars at him, and saving the other half, precious little, under his bunk mattress. Yesterday, Trask had gone into sudden convulsions. His face had turned as black as the ace of spades, and he had died. Lloyd had looked longingly at Trask's half-eaten lunch, but he had no way to reach it. Yesterday afternoon, there had still been a few guards on the floor, but they weren't carrying anyone down to the infirmary anymore, no matter how sick. Maybe they were dying down in the infirmary, too. And the warden decided to stop wasting the effort. No one came to remove Trask's body. Lloyd napped late yesterday afternoon, and when he woke, maximum security corridors were empty. No supper had been served. Now the place really did sound like the lion house at the zoo. Lloyd wasn't imaginative enough to wonder how much more savage it would have sounded if maximum security had been filled to its capacity. He had no idea how many were still alive and enough to yell for their supper, but the echoes made it sound like more. All Lloyd knew for sure was that Trask was gathering flies on his right, and the cell on his left was empty. The former occupant, a young jive-talking black guy who had tried to mug an old lady and had killed her instead, had been taken to the infirmary days back. Across the way, he could see two empty cells and the dangling feet of a man who was in for killing his wife and his brother-in-law during a penny Pokino game. The Pokino killer, as he had been called, had apparently opted out with his belt, or, if they had taken that, his own pair of pants. Later that night, after the lights had come on automatically, Lloyd had eaten some of the beans he had saved from 2 days ago. They tasted horrible, but he ate them anyway. He washed them down with water from the toilet bowl, and then crawled up on his bunk and clasped his knees against his chest, cursing Poke for getting him in such a mess. It was all Poke's fault. On his own, Lloyd never would have been ambitious to get into more than small-time trouble. Little by little, the roaring for food had quieted down, and Lloyd suspected he wasn't the only one who had been squirreling away some insurance. But he didn't have much. If he had really believed this was going to happen, he would have put away more. There was something in the back of his mind that he didn't want to see. It was as if there was a set of flapping drapes in the back of his mind, with something behind them. You could only see that thing's bony, skeletal feet below the hem of the drapes. That's all you wanted to see, because the feet belonged to the nodding, emaciated corpse, and his name was Starvation. Oh no, Lloyd said, someone's gonna come. Sure they are. Just as sure as shit sticks to a blanket. But he kept remembering the rabbit. He couldn't help it. He had won the rabbit and a cage to keep him in at the school raffle. His daddy didn't want him to keep it, but Lloyd had somehow persuaded him that he would take care of it and feed it out of his own allowance. What's up? He loved that rabbit, and he did take care of it at first. Trouble was, things slipped his mind after a while. It had always been that way. And one day, while he was swinging idly in the tire that hung from the sickly maple behind their scroggy little house in Marathon, Pennsylvania, he had suddenly sat bolt upright, thinking of that rabbit. He hadn't thought of his rabbit in better than 2 weeks. It had just completely slipped his mind. He ran to the little shed tacked onto the barn. Good. Go ahead and throw that away. Shed tacked onto the barn, and it had been summer just like it was now. And when he stepped into the shed, the bad smell of the rabbit had struck him in the face like a big old roundhouse slap. The fur he had liked so much to stroke was matted and dirty. White maggots crawled busily in the sockets that had once held his rabbit's pretty pink eyes. The rabbit's paws were ragged and bloody. He tried to tell himself that the paws were bloody because it had tried to scratch its way out of the cage. And that was undoubtedly how it had happened. But some sick, dark part of his mind spoke in a whisper and said that maybe the rabbit, in a final extremity of its hunger, had tried to eat itself. Lloyd had taken the rabbit away, dug a deep hole, and buried it, still in its cage. His father had never asked him about the rabbit, might even have forgotten that his boy had a rabbit. Lloyd was not terribly bright, but he was a mental giant when stacked up against his daddy. But Lloyd had never forgotten. always plagued by vivid dreams, and the death of the rabbit had occasioned a series of terrible nightmares. And now the vision of the rabbit returned as he sat on his bunk with his knees drawn up to his chest, telling himself that someone would come. Someone would surely come and let him go free. He didn't have this Captain Tripp's flu. He was just hungry, like his rabbit had been hungry, just like that. Sometime after midnight he had fallen asleep, and this morning he had begun to work on the leg of the bunk. And now, looking at his bloody fingers, he thought of the fresh horror about the paws of that long-ago rabbit, to whom he had meant no harm. By 1 o'clock on the afternoon of June 29th, he had the caught leg free. At the end, the bolt had given with stupid ease, and the leg had clanged to the floor of his cell, and he had just looked at it, wondering what in God's name he had wanted it for in the first place. It was about 3 feet long. He took it to the front of the cell and began to hammer furiously against the blued steel bars. "Hey!" he yelled, as the clanging bar gave off its deep, gong-like notes. "Hey, I want out! I want to get the fuck out of here, understand? Hey, goddammit, hey!" He stopped and listened to the echoes as the echoes faded. For a moment there was total silence, and then from the holding cell block came the rapturous, hoarse answer. "Mother! Down here, Mother! I'm down here!" "Jesus!" Lloyd cried, and threw the cog leg into the corner. He had struggled for hours, practically destroyed his fingers, just so he could wake that asshole up. He sat on his bunk, lifted the mattress, took out a piece of rough bread. He debated adding a handful of dates, told himself he should save them, and snatched them up anyway. He ate them one by one, grimacing, saving the bread for last, to take the slimy, fruity taste out of his mouth. When he was done with the miserable excuse for a meal, he walked aimlessly to the right side of his cell. He looked down and stifled a cry of revulsion. Trask was sprawled half on his cot and half off it, and his pants leg was pulled up a little. His ankles were bare above the prison slippers they gave you to wear. A long, sleek rat was lunching up on Trask's leg. Its repulsive pink tail was neatly coiled around its gray body. Lloyd walked to the other corner of his own cell and picked up the cog leg. He went back, stood for a moment, wondering if the rat would see him and decide to go off where the company wasn't quite so lively. The rat's back was to him, and as far as Lloyd could tell, the rat didn't even know he was there. Lloyd measured the distance with his eye and decided the cog leg would reach admirably. "Huh!" Lloyd grunted and swung the leg. It squashed the rat against Trask's leg, and Trask fell off his bunk with a stiff thump. The rat lay on its side, dazed, aspirating weakly. There were beads of blood from its whiskers. Its rat legs were moving, as if its ratty little brain was telling it to run. Somewhere, but along the spinal cord, the signals were getting all scrambled up. Lloyd hit it again and killed it. "There you are, you cheap fuck," Lloyd said. He put the cog leg down and wandered back to his bunk. He was hot and scared and felt like crying. He looked back over his shoulder and cried, "How do you like rat hell, you scuzzy little cocksucker?" "Mother!" the voice cried happily in answer. "Mother!" "Ah, shut up!" Lloyd screamed. "I ain't your mother. Your mother's in charge of blowjobs at a whorehouse in Asshole, Indiana." "Mother?" the voice said, now full of weak doubt. Then it fell silent. Lloyd began to weep. As he cried, he rubbed his eyes with his fists like a small boy. He wanted a steak sandwich. He wanted to talk to his lawyer. He wanted to get out of here. At last he lay down on his cot, put one arm over his eyes, and masturbated. It was a good way of getting to sleep as any. As good a way. When he woke up again, it was 5 p.m. and maximum security was dead quiet. Blearily, Lloyd got off his cot, which now leaned drunkenly toward the spot where one of its supports had been taken away. He got the cog leg, steeled himself for the cries of mother, and began hammering on the bars like a farm cock calling the hired hands in for the big country supper. Supper. Now there was a word. Had there ever been a finer? Ham steaks and potatoes with red-eye gravy and fresh new peas, and milk with Hershey's chocolate syrup to dump in it, and a great big old dish of strawberry ice cream for dessert. No, there had never been a word to match supper. Hey, ain't nobody there? Lloyd cried, his voice breaking. No answer, not even the cry of mother. At this point, he might have welcomed it. Even the company of the mad was better than the company of the dead. Lloyd let the cog leg drop with a crash. He stumbled back to his bunk, turned up the mattress, and made inventory. 2 more hunks of bread, 2 handfuls of dates, a half-gnawed pork chop, 1 piece of bologna. He pulled a slice of bologna in 2 and ate the big half, but that only whetted his appetite, brought it raging up. No more, he whispered, and grabbed the rest of the pork off the chop bone and called himself names and wept some more. He was going to die in here, just as his rabbit had died in its cage, just as Trask had died in his. Trask. He looked into Trask's cell for a long, thoughtful time, watching the flies circle and land and take off. There was a regular L.A. International Airport for flies right on old Trask's face. At long last, Lloyd got the cog leg, went to the bars, and reached through with it. By standing on the tiptoe, he could get just enough length to catch the rat's body and drag it toward his cell. When it was close enough, Lloyd got on his knees and pulled the rat through on its side. He picked it up by the tail, held the dangling body before his eyes for a long time. Then he put it under his mattress where the flies could not get to it, segregating the limp body from what remained of his food stash. He looked fixedly at the rat for a long time before letting the mattress fall back, mercifully hiding it from sight. Just in case, Lloyd Henry whispered into the silence. Just in case is all. Then he climbed up on the other side of the bunk, drew his knees up to his chin, and sat still. Chapter 33. At 22 minutes of 9, by the clock over the sheriff's office doorway, the lights went off. Nick Andrews had been reading a paperback he had taken from the rack in the drugstore, a Gothic novel about a frightened governess who thought the lonely estate she was supposed to be teaching a handsome master's sons was haunted. Although he wasn't even halfway through the book, Nick already knew the ghost was really the handsome master's wife, who was probably locked up in the attic and crazy as a loon. When the lights went out, he felt his heart lurch in his chest, and a voice whispered to him from deep in his mind, from the place where the nightmares, which now haunted him every time he fell asleep, lay in wait. He's coming for you. He's out there now, on the highway of the night. The highway's in hiding. The dark man. He dropped the novel on the desk and went out into the street. The last of the daylight hadn't gone out of the sky yet, but twilight was nearly over. All the street lights were dark. Fluorescents in the drugstore, which had burned night and day, were also gone. The subdued thrum of the junction boxes atop the power poles were also gone. This was something Nick verified by putting his hand on one and feeling nothing but wood. The vibration, which was to him a kind of hearing, had ceased. There were candles in the office supply cabinet, a whole box of them, but the thought of candles did not comfort Nick very much. The face of the lights going out had hit him very hard, and now he stood looking to the west, silently begging the light not to desert him and leave him in this dark graveyard. But the light did go, and it could no longer even pretend there was a little light left in the sky by 9:10. And he went to the office and fumbled his way into the cabinet where the candles were. He was feeling around on one of the shelves for the right box, where the door behind burst open and Ray Booth staggered inside, his face black and puffy, his LSU ring still glistening on his finger. He had been laid up in the woods close to town ever since the night of June 22nd, a week ago. By the morning of the 24th, he had been feeling sick, and at last, this evening, hunger and fear for his life had driven him down to town, where he had seen no one at all but the goddamn muty freak who had gotten him into this fix in the first place. Don't you eat that, baby. You have your bone. Thank you. The muty had been crossing the town square, just as big as Billy be damned, walking as if he owned the town where Ray had lived most of his life. The sheriff's pistol holstered at his right hip and secured to his thigh with a gunslinger's tie-down. Maybe he thought he did own the town. Ray suspected he was going to die of whatever had taken everyone else off. But first, he was going to show this goddamn freak that he didn't own jack shit. Nick's back was turned, and he had no idea he was no longer alone in the Sheriff Baker's office until the hands closed around his neck and locked there. The box he had just picked up fell out of his hands, wax candles breaking and rolling everywhere on the floor. He was half strangled before he got over his first terror, and he felt sudden certainty that the black creature of his dreams had come to life. Some friend of the basement of hell, from the basement of hell, was behind him, and had wrapped its scaled claws around his neck as soon as the power had failed. Then, convulsively, instinctively, he put his own hands over the hands that were throttling him and tried to pull them free. Hot breath blew against his right ear, making a wind tunnel there, which he could feel but not hear. He caught one clogged and rasping breath before the hands clamped tight again. The two of them swayed in the black like dark dancers. Ray Booth could feel his strength ebbing as the kid struggled. His head was pounding. If he didn't finish the muty quick, he would never finish him at all. Hiccup. He throttled the scrawny kid's neck with all the force left in his hands. Nick felt the world going away. The pain in his throat, which had been sharp at first, was now numb and far off, almost pleasant. He stamped his booted heel down hard on one of Booth's feet, and leaned his weight back against the big man at the same time. Booth was forced back a step. One of his feet came down on a candle. It rolled away under him, and he crashed to the floor with Nick back on top of him. His hands were finally jarred loose. Nick rolled away, breathing in harsh rasps. Everything seemed far off and floating, except for the pain in his throat, which had returned in slow, thudding bursts. He could taste slick blood in the back of his throat. The large, humped shape of whoever it was had jumped him was lurching to its feet. Nick remembered the gun and clawed for it. It was there, but it wouldn't come free. It was stuck in the holster somehow. He pulled at it mightily, now crazed with panic. It went off. The slug furrowed the side of his leg and embedded itself in the floor. The shape fell on him like dead fate. Nick's breath exploded out of him, and then large white hands were groping at his face, and thumbs gouging at his eyes. Nick saw a purple gleam on one of those hands with the faint moonlight, and his surprised mouth formed the words Booth in the darkness. His right hand continued to pull at the gun. He had barely felt the hot sizzle of pain along the length of his thigh, One of Ray Booth's thumbs jammed into Nick's right eye. Exquisite pain flared and sparkled in his head. He jerked the gun free at last. Booth's thumb worked calloused and hard. Stop it. Turned briskly, clock and counterclock, grinding Nick's eyeball. What? What? Nick, please pause and feed the dogs. Phoebe can eat in here and Harley can eat in there.
Okay.
Thank you. Nick uttered an amorphous scream, which was little more than a violent susurrus of air, and jammed the gun into Booth's flabby belly. He pulled the trigger and the gun made a muffled whoop, which Nick felt as a violent recoil. Go. You come here. Harley, go.
Harley, out!
I got Phoebe.
Move it!
Which Nick felt as a violent recoil that went nowhere but up his arm. The gunshot had snagged in Booth's shirt. Oh, the gun sight. Nick saw a muzzle flash, and a moment later smelled powder in Booth's charring shirt. Ray Booth stiffened, then slumped on top of him. Sobbing with pain and terror, Nick heaved against the weight on top of him, and Booth's body half slithered off him. Nick crawled out from underneath. One hand clapped over his wounded eye. He lay on the floor for a long time, his throat on fire. Put it down, please. Stop, thank you. Now, go out. Go out. And close the gate, please. Make sure you feed her. Thank you. His head felt as if giant, merciless calipers had been screwed into his temples.
Yeah.
At last he felt around, found a candle, and lit it with the desk lighter. By its weak yellow glow, he could see Ray Booth lying face down on the floor. He looked like a dead whale cast up on a beach. The gun had made a blackened circle on the side of his shirt, and the size of a flapjack. There was a great deal of blood. Booth's shadow stretched away to the far wall, in the candle's uncertain flicker, huge and unshaped. Moaning, Nick stumbled into the small bathroom, his hand still clapped over his eye, and then looked into the mirror. He saw blood seeping out from between his fingers and took his hand away reluctantly. He wasn't sure, but he thought he might now be one-eyed as well as deaf and dumb. He walked back into the office and kicked Ray Booth's limp body. You fixed me, he told the dead man. First my tooth and now my eye. Are you happy? You would have taken both eyes if you could have done it, wouldn't you? Taken my eyes and left me deaf, dumb, and blind in a world of the dead. How do you like this, homeboy? He kicked Booth again, and the feel of his foot sinking into the dead meat made him feel ill. After a little bit, he retreated to the bunk, sat on it, and put his head in his hands. Outside, the dark held hard. Outside, all the lights of the world were going out. Chapter 34. For a long time, for days, how many days who knew? Not the trash can man, that's for sure. Donald Merwin Albert, known to the inmates of his dim and confusing grade school past as the trash can man, had wandered up and down the streets of Pottonville, Indiana, cringing from the voices in his head, dodging away and putting up his hands to shield against stones thrown by ghosts. Hey, trash can man, digging you, trash. Lit any good fires this week? What old lady Semple say when you lit up her pension check, trash? Hey, trash baby, wanna buy some kerosene? How'd you like those shock treatments down in Terre Haute, trashy? Trash. Hey, trash can. Sometimes he knew those voices weren't real. But sometimes he would cry out loud for them to stop, only to realize that the only voice was his voice, hitting back at him from the houses and storefronts, bouncing off the cinder block wall of the Scuba Duba car wash, where he used to work, and where he sat in the morning of June 30th, eating a big sloppy Joe sandwich of peanut butter. Oh, sloppy sandwich of peanut butter and jelly, and tomatoes and Golden's Diablo mustard. Ooh. No voice but his voice, hitting the houses and stores and being turned away like an unwanted guest, and thus returning to his own ears. Because somehow, Pottonville was empty. Everyone was gone. Or were they? They had always said he was crazy, and that's something a crazy man would think, that his hometown was empty except for him. But his eyes kept returning to the oil tanks on the horizon, huge and white and round, like low clouds. They stood between Pottonville and the road to Gary and Chicago, and he knew that he wanted what he wanted to do. That wasn't a dream. It was bad, but not a dream, and he wasn't going to be able to help himself. Burn your fingers, trash? Hey, trash can man, don't you know playing with fire makes you wet the bed? Something seemed to whistle past him, and he sobbed and held up his hands, dropping his sandwich into the dust, cringing his cheek into his neck. But there was nothing. There was no one. Beyond the cinder block wall of the Scuba Duba car wash, there was only Indiana Highway 130, going to Gary, but first going past the huge Cherry Oil Company storage tanks. Sobbing a little, he picked up his sandwich, brushed the gray dirt off the white bread as best he could, and began to munch it again. Were they dreams? Once his father had been alive, and the sheriff had cut him down in the street right outside the Methodist church, and he had had to live with that his whole life. Hey, trash can, Sheriff Greenlee cut your old man down just like a mad dog. You know that, you fucking weirdo? His father had been in O'Toole's, and there was some bad talk, and Wendell Elbert had a gun, and he murdered the bartender with it. Then went home and murdered Trash Can's two older brothers and his sister with it. Oh, Wendell Elbert was a strange fellow with a badass temper, and he had been getting flaky for a long time before that night. Anyone in Pottonville would tell you so. And they would tell you, like father, like son. And he would have murdered Trashkin's mother, too, only Sally Elbert had fled, screaming into the night, with 5-year-old Donald, later to be known as the Trash Can Man, in her arms. Wendell Elbert had stood on the front steps, shooting at them as they fled, the bullets whining and striking on the road. And on the last shot, the cheap pistol, which Wendell had bought from a nigger in the bar located in Chicago's State Street, had exploded in his hand. The flying shrapnel had erased most of his face. He had gone wandering up the street, with blood running in his eyes, screaming and waving the remainder of the cheap pistol in one hand. The barrel mushroomed and split like the remains of a novelty exploding cigar. And just as he got to the Methodist church, Sheriff Freely pulled up in Pottonville's only squad car, commanded him to stand down and drop the gun. Wendell Elbert pointed the remains of his Saturday night special at the sheriff instead, and Greeley either did not notice that the barrel of the Saturday night special was ruptured or pretended not to notice. In either way, the result was the same. He gave Wendell Elbert both barrels of his over and under. A trash can. You burned your cock off yet? He looked around for whoever had yelled that. It sounded like Carly Yates or one of the kids who hung out with him, except Carly wasn't a kid anymore, any more than he was himself. Maybe now he could be just Don Elbert instead of the trash can man, the way Carly Yates was now just Carl Yates, who sold the cars at the Stout Chrysler Plymouth dealership here in town. Except that Carl Yates. Carl Yates was gone. Everyone was gone. Maybe it was too late for him to be anyone anymore. And he wasn't sitting against the wall of the Scuba Duba anymore. He was a mile or more to the northwest of town, walking along 130, and the town of Pontonville was laid out below him like a scale model community on a kid's HO railroad table. The tanks were only half a mile away, and he had a toolkit in one hand and a 5-gallon can of gas in the other. Oh, it was so bad, but... So after Wendell Elbert was underground, Sally Elbert had gotten a job at the Pondville Cafe, and sometime in the first or second grade, her one remaining chick, Donald Merwin Elbert, had started lighting fires in people's trash cans and running away. "Look out, girls, here comes Trash Can Man. He'll burn up your dress. Eek! A freak!" It wasn't until he was in the third grade or so that the grown-ups found out who was doing it, and then the sheriff came around, good old Sheriff Greeley, and he guessed that was how the man who had cut his father down in front of the Methodist church ended up being his stepfather. "Hey, Carly, got a riddle for you. How can your father kill your father?" "I don't know, Petey, how?" "I don't know either, but it helps if you're the trash can man." Hee ha 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 ha. He was standing at the head of the gravel drive now, his shoulders aching from carrying the toolkit and the gas. The sign at the gate read, "Cherry Petroleum Company, Inc. All visitors must check in at the office. Thanks." A few cars were parked in the lot, not many. Many were standing on flats. Trash can man walked up the drive and slipped through the gate, which was standing ajar. His eyes, blue and strange, were fixed on the spidery stairs that went around the nearest tank in a spiral, all the way to the top. There was a chain across the bottom of the stairs, and another sign swung from the chain. This one said, "Keep off. Pumping station closed." He stepped over the chain and started up the stairs. It wasn't right, his mother marrying Sheriff Greeley. The year he was in the fourth grade, he had started lighting fires in mailboxes. That was the year he burned up old Miss Semple's pension check, and he got caught again. Sally Albert Greeley went into hysterics. That one time her new husband mentioned sending the boy to that place down in Terre Haute. "You think he's crazy." How can a 10-year-old boy be crazy? "I think you just want to get rid of him. You got rid of his father and now you want to get rid of him." The only other thing Greeley could do was to bring the boy up on charges, and you can't send a kid of 10 to reform school, not unless you want him to come out with a size 11 asshole, not unless you want your new wife to divorce you. Up the stairs and up the stairs. His feet made little ringing noises on the steel. He had left the voices down below, and no one could throw a stones this high. The cars in the parking lot looked like twinkling corgi toys. There was only the wind's voice, talking low in his ear and moaning in the vent somewhere. That and the far-off call of a bird. Trees and open fields spread out all around, all in shades of green, only slightly blued by the dreaming morning haze. He was smiling now, happy, as he followed the steel spiral up and around and around. When he got to the tank's flat, circular cap, it seemed that he must be standing directly under the roof of the world. And if he reached up, he could scratch blue chalk from the bottom of the sky with his fingertips. He put the gas can and the toolkit down and just looked. From here, you could actually see Gary, because the industrial smokes that usually poured from its factory stacks were absent, and the air up that way was as clear as it was down here. Chicago was a dream wrapped in summer haze, and there was a faint blue glint to the far north that was either Lake Michigan or just wishful thinking. The air had a soft golden aroma that made him think of a calm breakfast in a well-lighted kitchen. And soon the day would burn, leaving the gas where it was. He took the toolkit over to the pump machinery and began to puzzle it out. He had an intuitive grasp of machinery. He could handle it the way certain idiots, savants, can multiply and divide 7-digit numbers in their heads. Oh, idiot savants. There was nothing thoughtful or cognitive about it. He simply let his eyes wander here and there for a few moments, and then his hands would move with quick, effortless confidence. A trash can. Why'd you want to burn up the church? Why didn't you burn up the school? When he was in the 5th grade, he had started a fire in the living room of a deserted house in the neighboring town of Sedley, and the house burned flat. His stepfather, Sheriff Greeley, put him in the cooler because a gang of kids had beaten him up, and now the grown-ups wanted to start. Why, if it hadn't rained, we could have lost half the township thanks to that goddamn firebug kid. Greeley told Sally that Donald would have to go down to that place in Terre Haute and have the tests. Sally said she would leave him if he did that to her baby, her only chick and child. But Greeley went ahead and got the judge to sign the order. And so the trash can man left Pontonville for a while, for 2 years, and his mother divorced the sheriff. And later that year, the voters disowned the sheriff, and Greeley ended up going to Gary to work on an auto assembly line. Sally came to see Trash every week and always cried. Trash can whispered, "There you are, motherfucker," and then looked around furtively to see if anyone could hear him say the bad swear. Of course no one had, because he was on top of Cherry Oil's #1 storage tank. And even if he had been down on the ground, there was no one left, except for ghosts. Above him, fat white clouds floated by. A large pipe projected out of the tangle of pumping machinery. It bore better than 2 feet, and its end threaded to take what the oil people called a clutch hose. It was strictly for outflow or overflow. The tank was now full of unleaded gas, and some of it had trickled out, perhaps a pint, cutting shiny tracks through the light fall of dust on the tank. Trash can stood back, eyes bright, still gripping a large wrench in one hand and the hammer in the other. He dropped them, and they clanged. He wouldn't need the gasoline he'd brought after all. He picked up the can, yelled "Bombs away," and dropped it over the side. He watched its tumbling, glinting progress with great interest. A third of the way down, it hit the stairs, bounced off, and then fell all the way to the ground, turning over and over, spraying amber gas from the side that had been punched open when it hit the stairs. He turned back to the outflow pipe. He looked at the shiny puzzles of gasoline. He took a package of paper matches from his breast pocket and looked at them, guiltily and fascinated and excited. There was an ad on the front that said you could get an education in most anything you wanted at LaSalle Correspondence School in Chicago. I'm standing on a bomb, he thought. Closed his eyes, trembled in fear and ecstasy. The old cold excitement on him, making his toes and fingers feel numb. Hey, Trash, you fucking firebug. The place in Terre Haute let him go when he was 13. If he was cured or not, but they said he was. They needed his room so that they could put some other crazy kid in it for a couple of years. Trash can went home. He was way behind in his schoolwork now, and he couldn't seem to catch the hang of it. They had given him shock treatments in Terre Haute, and he got back to Pontonville, and when he got back to Pontonville, he couldn't remember things. He could study for a test and then forget half the stuff and flung with a 60 or 40 or something like that. For a while he didn't light any fires, though. That was that, at least. There was that, at least. Everything had gone back to the way it should be, it seemed. The father-killing sheriff was gone. He was up there in Gary putting headlights on Dodges, putting wheels on miscarriages, his mother sometimes said. His mother was back working at the Pontonville Cafe. It was all right. Of course, there was the cherry oil. It was all right. Of course, there was cherry oil, the white tanks rising on the horizon like oversized whitewashed tin cans, and behind them the industrial smokes from Gary, where the father-killing sheriff was, as if Gary was already on fire. He often wondered how the cherry oil tanks would go up. 3 single explosions, loud enough to rip your eardrums to tatters, and brought enough to fry your eyeballs in their sockets, and bright enough to fry your eyeballs in their sockets. 3 pillars of fire, father, son, and holy father-killing sheriff. That would burn day and night for months. Or would they seem not to burn at all? He would find out. The soft summer breeze puffed out the first 2 matches he lit, and he dropped their blackened stumps onto the riveted steel. Off to his right, near the knee-high railing that circled the edge of the tank, there was a bug struggling weakly in a puddle of gasoline. I'm like that bug, he thought resentfully, and wondered what kind of world it was where God would not only let you be caught in a big sticky mess like a bug in a puddle of gas, but leave you there alive and struggling for hours, maybe days, or in this case, for years, or in his case, for years. It was the world that deserved to burn. That was what. He stood, head bowed, a 3rd match ready to strike, when the breeze died. For a while, when he came back, he was called loony, or and half-wit, and torchy. Carly Yates, who was by then 3 grades ahead, remembered the trash cans, and it was Carly's name that stuck. When he turned 16, he left school with his mother's permission. Would you expect? Would you expect? They ruined him down there in Terre Haute. I'd sue him if I had the money. Shock treatments, they called it. Goddamn electric chair, I call it. And went to work at the Scrubba Dubba car wash. Soap the lights, soap the rocker panels, knock the wipers, wipe the mirrors. Hey, mister, you want hot wax with that? For a little while longer, things went their appointed course. People would yell at him from street corners or passing cars, would want to know what old Lady Semple, now 4 years in her grave, had said when he lit up her pension check, or if he had wet the bed after he torched that house over in Sedley. And they'd catcall to each other as they lounged in front of the candy store or leaned into the doorway of O'Toole's. They'd holler at each other to hide their matches or butt their smokes before the trash can man was on his way. The voices all became phantom voices, but the rocks were impossible to ignore when they came buzzing from the mouths of dark alleys or from the other side of the street. Once someone had pegged a half-full can of beer at him from a passing car, and the beer can had struck him on the forehead and had driven him to his knees. That was life. The voices, the occasional flying rock, scrub-a-dubba. And on his lunch break, he would sit where he had been sitting today, eating the BLT his mother had made for him, looking at the cherry oil tanks and wondering which way it would be. That was life, anyway, until one night he found himself in the vestibule of the Methodist Church with a 5-gallon can of gasoline, splashing it everywhere, especially on the heaps of old hymnals in the corners. And he had stopped and thought, this is bad. Maybe worse than that. It's stupid. They know who did it. They'll know who did it. They'd know who did it even if someone else did it. And they'll put you away. He thought about it, smelled the gas while the Voices fluttered and circled in his head like bats in a haunted belfry. Then a slow smile came to his face, and he had upended the gas can, and he had run straight up the center aisle with it. The gas sprang out. All the way from the vestibule to the altar he had run, like a groom late to his own wedding, and so eager that he had begun to spray hot fluid, more properly meant for his soon-to-be marriage bed. Then he had run back to the vestibule, pulled a single wooden match from his breast pocket, scratched it on the zipper of his jeans, flung the match in the pile of dripping hymnals, direct hit, flump, and the next day he was riding to the North Indiana Correctional Center for Boys, past the black and smoldering ribs of the Methodist Church. And there was Carly Yates, leaning against the light standard across from the scrub-a-dubba, a lucky strike passed in the corner of his mouth. And Carly had yelled his valley, his epithet, his hail and farewell. "A trash can? What'd you want to burn up the church? Why didn't you burn up the school?" He was 17 when he went to the jail for kids, and when he turned 18, they sent him over to the state prison. And how long would he be there? How long was he there? He knew. Who knew? Not the trash can man, that was for sure. No one in stir cared that he had burned the Methodist church down. There were people in stir who had done much worse: murder, rape, breaking open the heads of old lady librarians. Some of the inmates wanted to do something to him, and some of them wanted him to do something to them. He didn't mind. It happened after the lights were out. One man with a bald head had said he loved him. "I love you, Donald." And that was sure better than dodging rocks. Sometimes he would think, just as long as I can stay in here forever. Sometimes at night he would dream of cherry oil. Cheery oil. Oh, it's cheery oil, not cherry oil. Cheery oil, and in the dreams it was always a single thundering explosion followed by two others, and the sound of wham, wham, wham. Huge, toneless explosions, slamming their way into bright daylight, shaping the daylight like the blows of the hammer, shaping thin copper. And everyone in town would stop what they were doing and look north toward Gary, toward where the three tanks stood against the sky like oversized whitewashed tin cans. Carly Yates would be trying to sell a 2-year-old Plymouth to a young couple with a baby, and he would stop in mid-spiel and look. The idlers in the O'Toole's and in the candy store would crowd outside, leaving their beers and chocolate malteds behind. In the cafe, his mother would pause in front of the cash register. The new boy at the scrub-a-dubba would straighten from the headlights he had been soaping, the sponge glove still on his hand, looking north at that large and portentous sound sledgehammered its way into the thin copper routine of the day. Wham! That was his dream. He became a trustee somewhere along the line, and when the strange sickness came, they sent him to the infirmary, and some days ago there had been no more sick people because all of those who had been sick were now dead. Everybody was dead or had run off, except for the young guard named Jason Debbins, who sat behind the wheel of the prison laundry truck and shot himself. And okay. And where else did he have to go then, except home? The breeze pressed softly against his cheek and then died. He struck another match and dropped it. It landed in the small pool of gasoline and the gas caught. The flames were blue. They spread out delicately, a kind of corona with the burned match stub at its center. Trash Can watched for a moment, paralyzed with fascination, and then he stepped quickly to the stairs that circled around the tank at the bottom. looking back over his shoulder. He could see the pumping machinery through the heat haze now, flickering back and forth like a mirage. The blue flames, no more than 2 inches high, spread toward the machinery and toward the open pipe in a widening semicircle. The bug's struggles had ended. It was nothing but a blackened husk. I could let that happen to me. And he didn't seem to want to. It seemed vaguely that there might be another purpose in his life now. Something very grand and great. So he felt the touch of fear. Microwave. Touch of fear, and he began to descend the steps on the run. His shoes clanging, his hand slipping quickly over the steep, rust-pitted railing. Down and down, circling, wondering how long until the vapor hanging over the mouth of the overflow pipe would catch. How long before heat, great enough for ignition, would rush down the pipe's throat and into the tank's belly. Hair flying back from his forehead, a terrified grin pasted on it to his face, the wind roaring in his ears, he rushed down. Now he was halfway, racing past the letters CH, letters 20 feet high and lime green against the white of the tank. Down and down. And if his flying feet stuttered or caught on anything, he would tumble like the gas can had tumbled, his bones breaking like dead branches. The ground came closer, the white gravel circles around the tanks, the green grass beyond the gravel. The cars in the parking lot began to regain their normal size. And still, he seemed to be floating in a dream, and he would never reach the bottom, only run and get nowhere. He was next to the bomb, and the fuse was lit. From far overhead, there came a sudden bang, like a 5-inch 4th of July firecracker. Then there was a dim clang, and then something whirled past him. It was part of the overflow pipe. He saw with a sharp and almost delicious fear. It was totally black and twisted in the new and excitingly senseless shape by the heat. He placed one hand on the railing and vaulted over, hearing something snap in his wrist. Sickening pain flowed up his arm to his elbow. He dropped the last 5 feet, landed on the gravel, and went sprawling. The gravel scraped skin from his forearms, but he hardly felt it. He was full of moaning, grinning panic now, and the day seemed very bright. Trash can man scrambled up, craning his head around and back, sending his gaze up even as he began to run again. The top of this middle tank had grown yellow hair, and the hair was growing at an amazing rate. The whole thing could blow at any second. That's loud. He ran, his right hand flopping on its broken wrist. He leaped over the parking lot curb, and his feet slapped on asphalt. Now he was across the parking lot, his shadow trailing at its feet. And now he was running straight down the wide gravel access road and bolted through the half-open gate and back onto Highway 130. He ran straight across it and flung himself into the ditch on the far side, landing on the soft bed of dead leaves and wet moss. His arms wrapped around his head, the breath tearing in and out of his lungs like stabbing jackknives. The oil tank blew, not wham, but ka-wham. A sound so huge, yet at the same time so short and guttural, that he felt his eardrums actually press in and his eyeballs press out as the air somehow changed. A second explosion followed, then a third. The trash can withered on the dead leaves and grinned and smiled soundlessly. He sat up, holding his hands over his ears. And sudden wind struck him and slapped him flat with such power that he might have been no more than a piece of litter. The young saplings behind him bent over backward, and their leaves made a frantic whirling sound, like the pennants over a used car lot on the windy day. One or two snapped with small cracking sounds, as if someone was shooting a target pistol. Burning pieces of tank started to fall on the other side of the road, some actually on the road. They hit with a clanging noise, the rivets still hanging in some of the chunks of metal, twisted and black as the overflow pipe had been. Ka-wham! Trash can sat up again and saw a gigantic fire tree beyond the Cherry Oil parking lot. Black smoke was billowing from its top, rising straight to an amazing height before the wind could disrupt it and rafter it away. You couldn't look at it without squinting your eyes and almost shout, and now there was a radiant heat baking across the road at him, tightening his skin and making it feel shiny. His eyes were gushing water in protest. Another burning chunk of metal, this one better than 7 feet across at its widest and shaped like a diamond, fell out of the sky, landed in the ditch 20 feet to his left, and the dry leaves on top of the wet moss were instantly ablaze. Ka-wham! Ka-wham! If he stayed there, he would go up in a jigging, scared blaze of spontaneous combustion, screaming blaze of spontaneous combustion. He scrambled to his feet and began to run along the shoulder of the highway in the direction of Gary, the breath getting hotter and hotter in his lungs. The air had begun to taste like heavy metal. Presently, he began to feel his hair to see if it had started burning. The sweet stench of gasoline filled the air, seeming to coat him. Hot wind ripped his clothes. He felt like something trying to escape from a microwave oven. The road doubled before his watering eyes, then trebled. There was another coughing roar as rising air pressure caused the Cherry Oil Company office building to implode. Scimitar's of glass whickered through the air. Chunks of concrete and cinder block rained out of the sky and hailed on the road. A whizzing piece of steel that was the size of a quarter and the thickness of a Mars bar. Size of a quarter, that doesn't seem very big. And the thickness of a Mars bar slipped through the trash can's shirt sleeve and made a thick scrape on his skin. A piece big enough to have turned his head to guava jelly struck in front of his feet, and then bounded away, leaving a good-sized crater behind. Then he was beyond the fallout zone, still running, the blood beating in his head as if his very brain had been sprayed with number 2 heating oil and then set ablaze. Ka-wham! There was another one of the tanks, and the air resistance in front of him seemed to disappear, and a large, warm hand pushed him firmly from behind, a hand that fitted every contour of his body from heels to head. It shoved him forward, with his toes barely touching the road, and now his face bore the terrified, pants-wetting grin of someone who had been attached to the world's biggest kite and a high cap of wind, and let loose to fly, 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 baby, up into the sky until the wind goes somewhere else, leaving him to scream all the way down in a helpless power dive. From behind a perfect full fusillade of explosions, God's ammunition dump going up in the flames of righteousness. Satan storming heaven, his artillery captain in a fiercely grinning fool with the red, flayed cheeks, trash can man by name, never to be Donald Merwin Elbert again. Sights jittering by, cars wrecked off the road, Mr. Strang's blue mailbox with the flag up, a dead dog with its legs up, power line down in a cornfield. The hand was not pushing him quite so hard now. Resistance had come back in front. Trash risked a glance back over his shoulder and saw that the knoll where the oil tanks had stood was a mess of fire. Everything was burning. The road itself seemed to be on fire back there, and he could see the summer trees going up like torches. He ran another quarter-mile, then dropped into a puffing, blowing, scrambling walk. A mile farther on he rested, looking back, smelling the good smell of burning. With no fire trucks and no firefighters to put it out, it would go whatever way the wind took it. It might burn for months. Tauntonville would go, and the fire line would march south, destroying houses, villages, farms, crops, meadows, forests. It might get as far south as Terre Haute, and it would burn that place he had been in. It might burn farther, in fact. His eyes turned north again toward Gary. He could see the town now, its great stacks standing quite quiet and blameless, like strokes of chalk on the light blue blackboard. Chicago beyond that. How many oil tanks? How many gas stations? How many trains standing silent on rails, full of LP gas, flammable fertilizer? How many slums, as dry as kindling? How many cities beyond Gary and Chicago? There was a whole country ripe for burning under the summer sun. Grinning, trash can man got to his feet and began to walk. His skin was already going lobster red. He didn't feel it, although that night it would keep him awake in a kind of exultation. There were bigger and better fires ahead. His eyes were soft and joyful and utterly crazy. They were the eyes of a man who had discovered the great axle of his destiny and laid his hands upon it. And that is where we're going to stop for now. I got a few things I need to do tonight. I wanted to get a little bit of reading in. And we did 3 chapters, 32, 33, 34, that I wanted to do. So that is where we're going to stop for now. And we will continue with 35 tomorrow morning. There. We're almost 40 chapters in. We might actually get this done by this weekend. I'd be surprised. That would be awesome. So anyway, I wanted to just say thank you for being here. Thank you for joining me. Follow if you haven't, so you know when I'm going to stream. I try to stick to my schedule of 11 and 7. Yeah. We finally learned about Trash Can Man. I was wondering when he was going to come in. So, right now, it looks like they're describing everybody, but there's going to be a lot of action that comes up. So, yeah. We'll see how everybody goes, because you got to remember, if you've actually watched the movie, you know how the progressive of events goes. And there are some people we just haven't met yet. So, we will see how things go. But I just wanted to say thank you. And hopefully you guys have a good night. And, yeah. I'm going to let you guys go for now. Remember, I love y'all. Thank you so much for being here. And I will talk to you tomorrow morning. Bye.